Hi, and welcome to Thursday Tutorials. My name is Keegan with Cloth Studio. Today I'm going to be showing you how to create a continuous bias binding strip that has only one seam. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a square. In the description for this tutorial, you'll find a link for a PDF document that will explain all of the different mathematical equations that you need to do in order to determine how big of a square you need for your particular binding strips. It will largely depend on whether you want 2.25, or 2.5 inch wide binding, and the dimensions of all four sides of your quilt. Once you figure that out, you're going to cut out your square. This particular square that I'm using for this demonstration is a 15-inch square. The 15-inch square will produce 90 inches of continuous bias binding when you are cutting at 2.5-inch strips. What we're going to go ahead and start with is we're going to take our ruler and we're going to line up a 45-degree line on the left edge, and we're going to slice all the way through our square from corner to corner. It's important that we line up right here to make sure that it's completely nice and even, and then we're going to slice all the way through to create two triangles. Once we've done that, we can separate the two and you'll see that we have the two different ones. We want to create one rhombus piece, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this edge and attach it to the opposite edge of the material. When it opens up, it should create this rhombus shape right here. This is very similar for those that have done previous methods of bias binding cutting. I'm going to go ahead and set up my machine, and I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam and press my seams open. Once I've done that, I'll be coming back. Okay, so now that I have my machine set up, I'm going to sew this seam together with a 1/4 inch seam. If you don't feel comfortable with the 1/4 inch offset of the triangle ends, then it will be important for you to pin to make sure that's exactly in place and measure. Okay, so now we're going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam. We're going to connect those two triangles together all the way down, making that rhombus shape. Okay, perfect. Once I've gone ahead and sewn this, I'm going to take this over to my iron and I'm going to press my seams open, and we'll be back at the cutting table. Okay, so now we're back at the cutting table. What we're going to do is we're going to take our long ruler and we're going to measure exactly how wide we want our strips to be. In these cases, for the bias binding strips, you are either going to have 2-inch, 2.25, or 2.5-inch bias binding strips. For the examples that I've given you. I've given you mathematical equations and an example for the 2.25 inch increments in order to determine if you like your bias binding strips a little bit wider or a little bit shorter, depending on the project that you are working on. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to mark mine for 2.5 inches because that is my personal preference. Once I have my first one lined up on the edge, I'm going to take a friction marker and I'm going to go ahead and mark on the wrong side of the material 2.5 inch increments all the way across the entire length. Going to mark another 2.5 inches, and the next 2.5 inch increment, 1, 2.5, is going to be 2.5 inches from the previous strip that we marked. Make sure the lines are visible because those are going to be important for us. Okay, And we'll repeat the process. Rinse and repeat. Perfect. Now that we have all of this completely marked, we're going to go ahead and go to the next step. Okay, so now that you've marked all of your lines, what we're going to do is we're going to match up opposite lines so that there is one layer of continuous overlap. So it might seem a little strange, but we're going to mark all of the points with pins so that we can then sew our 1/4 inch seam and then be able to cut through them so that it is continuous at the end. The larger your square, the less of weirdness you're going to have here at the bottom. So because I'm only using a 15-inch square, that would be the reason why it looks a little strange. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this seam together, or the second seam total, for this continuous binding all the way to the bottom. So it will be offset by one continuous strip. Okay, so now that I'm back at the sewing machine, I'm going to go ahead and sew that 1/4 inch seam, shutting the loop. I'm going to remember to take out my pins as I go. And now all of that is sewn shut. I'm going to go ahead and press that seam open, and then we'll be back with some scissors and our piece. Okay, so now we're back. We're going to go ahead and cut our continuous binding, and we're just going to use, I'm using these spring action scissors, which are really great for cutting these strips, but I'm just going to cut on the lines that I previously drew. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to go around in all of the circle, and everything should be lined up just perfect as we go along. We'll have created all of this binding with barely 2 seams. I love these scissors. They are really, really easy on the hands. You can just perfectly get through everything that you need to and not have so much hand fatigue in the process. Now you might be asking yourself, this looks like a very time-consuming process. Well, sort of, but you also have to think about it this way. Would it be even more time-consuming for you if you had to piece all these individual pieces together? That is the question you have to ask yourself. There's tons of methods to do bias binding. This just happens to be one that is pretty easy as far as if you have difficulty joining bias ends together, but still being able to get a bias strip that is then continuous and long. And I'm going to cut all the way through and slip off that excess. And this is all the excess that we're left with for a 15-inch square, and we now have 90 inches of continuous binding. What I'm going to do then is I would fold this in half, iron it, and then stitch it down to my project, which we'll show in future videos. And just like that, we have 90 inches of complete continuous bias binding just from a 15-inch square and 2 individual seams. We hope you've enjoyed this Thursday tutorial. We'll see you back next week for a brand new tutorial, as well as on Tuesday at 2 for a small tip. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.